The easiest way to imagine our home and workspaces is as if we are bugs in a jar. If you had the choice, would you rather be in a jar where the kids poked holes in the lid or not? I think most of us would prefer not to be in the jar at all, but based on our climate, we seem to have little choice. But this is why we always ask, how can architecture be more like camping? Our most memorable and photographed moments are typically outside, where we experience the benefits of fresh air, clean water, and the beauty of abundant nature. How can we provide this in the architecture that we inhabit for more than 90% of our lives while maintaining a comfortable temperature? We try to think about architecture as a mediator between the scale of human anatomy and physiology and the larger environment, where every building is a kind of crystalline extension of our anatomy and physiology. All biological needs, from fresh food to fresh air and water, must be delivered through infrastructure to us, and that in turn must be exported as wastes. And a good air quality strategy should be one that strives to replicate the conditions found in outdoor air, from CO2 to particulates, from radon to TVOC. That's easy to do in new buildings with airtight construction and controlled ventilation. But what happens when you move into a house you did not design, or when you're asked to remedy poor air quality in an existing building? This is our house in Barrie, which had no planned ventilation strategy. Here we see dangerous levels of radon, particulates, TVOC, and a buildup of CO2 that often exceeds 2,000 parts per million. But our house is the norm and not the exception. Human evolution and the emergence of architecture and science is, on the scale of our existence, a pretty recent thing. In a few 100,000 years, we've moved from improvised shelters and caves to creating cave-like architecture of stacked rocks. And only recently did we venture beyond our own planet. Nothing teaches us about the benefits of an atmosphere like the need to design for a less celestial body without one. The early Apollo spacecraft had a highly flammable, pure oxygen environment for a number of reasons, not the least of which was the close quarters, cost, and weight of CO2 scrubbers. What we exhale is a kind of atmospheric poop that needs to be cleaned up by plants. That's the deal we have with nature. We inhale almost a kilogram of air every day and exhale as much as a kilogram of CO2 per day. If we're in an airtight house, we basically need to change the air diapers at a pretty regular interval, or we start to suffer from a wide range of health effects. So when the oil crisis hit shortly before the space race began, building science emerged. We applied many of the lessons learned from the space program, but in a more do-it-yourself, low-tech, and low-budget way. Some consequences of these early airtight buildings led to excessive temperatures, poor indoor air quality, humidity, and mold, which led to the need for dedicated ventilators with heat recovery. The type of environmental control and life support systems used in space now is more advanced because we're spending longer times aboard spacecraft. A wide range of geometric, orbital, rotational, or passive methods have to be deployed to control the effects of radiation and heat gain and losses, and likewise with the balance of gases and air quality for respiration. In architecture, we also now deploy both active and passive thermal control strategies together with a targeted air tightness ratio. We ventilate with 100% fresh air systems with heat recovery using controls that are connected to indoor air quality sensors. This way we can ventilate and control particulates and humidity while avoiding the buildup of CO2. The smaller the spaces we occupy, the more quickly CO2 buildup occurs. CO2 is an excellent proxy for air quality in general because if we're ventilating to control CO2, we find we're also replacing other harmful gases such as radon and particulates. As CO2 increases, we begin to observe cognitive impairment and other health effects, but also the increased transmission of airborne diseases such as COVID-19. But the goalposts keep moving. With the steady increase of CO2 in the atmosphere, the harder it becomes to deploy strategies for indoor air quality. The dangers that we face due to unmitigated climate change means that we also need to work towards keeping global atmospheric CO2 well below a defined threshold. If CO2 is the threshold we're targeting for global mean temperature increase, this translates to roughly 500 ppm of atmospheric CO2. Health Canada has recently defined an upper limit for CO2 indoors of 1,000 parts per million for homes and schools. When the director of the EPA, Lisa Jackson, demanded CO2 be defined as a pollutant, the Obama administration refused to consider it, at which point she resigned. How many schools or homes in Canada comply with these new recommendations? The answer is very few. I'd propose 5 basic steps we need to take in order to arrive at, first of all, a better awareness of the issues, and the first step is to measure. Due to the pandemic, we're seeing the widespread adoption of measuring devices or sensors. If outdoor air is 431 ppm of CO2 and indoor air is 956, how can we do better? The second step is to ventilate. The least cost and simplest way to improve ventilation can be as simple as cracking a window open a few inches in the case of buildings that don't have a dedicated ventilation strategy, such as our older home in Barrie. And if you want to get fancy, you can add a single through-the-wall HRV to frequently used room like a master bedroom. Once you've remedied your air changes by measuring and monitoring your ventilation, the third step is to filter air locally or centrally. A standalone HEPA filter can cost as little as $300, or you can make your own box fan for less. If you suffer from allergies, you live in an area with frequent wildfires, or you're in a congregate environment where COVID transmission risks are elevated. Our furnace recently died, so while we had planned to make our home a net zero renovation, we were forced to replace our mechanical systems before we could start our envelope renovation. So we opted for a hybrid furnace that can become the air handler for a 100% electric air source heat pump, and we opted to add an ERV. While the cost of this replacement was over $8,000, we finally have our IIQ levels under reasonable thresholds. The fifth and final step for us was to connect our so-called smart home automation services to talk to our ERV so that we can dial in our air quality. Equipment controls are simply not as advanced as current sensors or home automation hubs. So after switching to an Ecobee thermostat, the system now works, but with limited controls. At least we can set ventilation to get CO2 under 800 ppm. The Spanish flu, also known as the 1918 flu pandemic, had an estimated death toll of between 17 to 50 million people, and possibly as high as 100 million. Having a better understanding of air quality in general can increase human health, but also prevent airborne transmission of diseases. And it'll also help us repeat a third and successive waves of this pandemic, not to mention refining our awareness of the looming health crisis that is global climate change. Thanks.